And by the way, we are beginning what I would say my favorite part, because this is the most interesting part of the class. There are some of the philosophers who are really unique and have very interesting perspectives on reality. And the closer we get to our time, obviously the more relevant it becomes. Even though the ideas are essentially the same, and it all goes back to this ancient Greek philosophy, which we talked about at the beginning, but nonetheless, it's more approachable for us because we do not live in ancient Greece, right? So we have the problems which are somewhat different from the problems they had. They are also human beings just like we are, but nonetheless, for them it was kind of a different world, and they looked at it differently. But philosophers such as George Berkeley, who we'll talk about today, they already have a lot more in common with us. And even though George Berkeley lived 300 years ago, nonetheless, that's already much closer to our time than like 2,400 years ago, right? Or even 2,000 years ago. So he is already modern in many ways. And like I said, he is quite interesting. He is also representative of this same British empiricism school, although he was actually Irish. One of the most well-known Irish philosophers. And by the way, that's actually kind of interesting because today is St. Patrick's Day, right? And that's Irish, originally Irish holiday. So kind of symbolic to have Irish philosopher on that day. Pure coincidence, but nonetheless couldn't have been better timed. Okay, let's first again look a little bit at Locke. And note that, just like I told you last time, there's a little bit of a difference the way we do it. And what is the difference? Well, those are not exactly matching those questions on the review. Some of the questions on the review, for example, what is God of the gaps? We're not going to review right now. So if you want to, if you missed last lecture, if you want to know them, go back there. Also, we may be, again, saying it in a little bit of a different way than we did during class. So again, if you want to prepare for the exam, the best way is to rewatch the video and note that I marked very clearly all these important slides there which you need to know for the exam. So you will see the same thing today throughout this lecture. And there's like red lettering for the stuff which you really need to know, and asterisk next to the title of the slide. So very clearly marked. Nonetheless, we do need to review a few things from the last lecture. And the reason is because they all connected. Things we'll be talking about today, they are connected to things we were talking about on Monday. So first of all, representative realism. What was the representative realism? Did you get that much? No, that actually is not correct. Here's how it works. What we perceive is representative of the real world, but it is not the real world itself. Note that the representation is basically a picture of something. That's what we say. This is a representation of, I don't know, President Biden. What are we talking about? Are we talking about Biden standing in front of you? No, when we say this is a representation, we're talking about his picture, his painting, or something else. So representative realism, it's the realism which talks about representations of reality rather than reality itself. So this is important about Locke. Locke was actually saying we do not have direct access to reality. We have a representation of reality, which is what? The ideas in our mind. Those ideas, he was saying, perfectly well represent the world as it really is. Nonetheless, we don't have direct access to this world. Yeah, so that's the difference. Locke was realist. He was saying the world really exists. It's right there. There are pens and other stuff. Unfortunately, however, we do not have direct access to all this stuff. All we have direct access to is our mind and the ideas inside our mind. And so for this reason, we just take it for granted that these ideas represent the world. Which makes sense, kind of. But you will see how Berkeley reacts to that. Now, what are the abstract ideas he was talking about? Well, God would be one example, but it's not just God. So, for example, a dog. Why is a dog abstract idea? A dog is abstract idea. Why? Well, have you ever had a dog in front of you and not a dog named Joey or a dog named, I don't know, Bubbly? Have you ever had in front of you abstract idea of a dog? When somebody says a dog, note that you have an idea what they are talking about, but it's not a particular idea of a dog named Joey. Similar with triangle. What is triangle? Does it have to be equilateral, for example? Not really. Anything we talk about, as long as it's not a particular thing, like this pen is a particular thing, but a pen is an abstract idea. So it's not just God, but he was saying literally any object we can form an abstract idea of by simply extracting certain qualities. So you see many dogs in your life. You see dog named Joey, maybe the first dog you ever seen. Then you seen another dog, then one more dog, then 10,000 other dogs. And you have formed this idea of a dog, which is neither Joey, no Bubbly, no, I don't know, whatever other dog you may think of, but a dog in general. So that is the abstract idea. God is like that too, but note the difference. You really never have met God, but you have met dogs, and you have met people, and you have met cats. Nonetheless, you have the abstract idea of a human being, which is none of these particular people. You have an abstract idea of a cat, which is none of these particular cats. So this is what Locke was saying abstract ideas are. Okay, what according to Locke is the difference between primary and secondary qualities? So you could just give examples. What are the primary qualities? Shape, motion, that would be some of the primary qualities. And yes, the subjective qualities such as color, taste, that would be the example of the secondary qualities. Okay, so William, good job. Yes, so this is the difference between primary and secondary according to Locke. All of this stuff, like I said, will be important today. Another question, what according to Locke is a physical substance? What do we know about it? And remember, we've been talking about substances for quite some time. They go all the way back where? To Aristotle. Nonetheless, we still don't know what it is. What was Locke saying substances? Okay, let me help you. Substance is basically something where all the secondary qualities are bunched up, attached. But he was also saying, even though there's definitely something which is a substance, we don't know anything about it. We have no idea what it is. Why? Well, because we can't really penetrate things to that level. We know that all these secondary qualities have to be attached to something. Something has color, something has a particular feel when you touch it or taste it, but what exactly is it? He said, we don't know. Now, what did he think is the difference between material and spiritual substance? So what's the difference between material and spiritual? Remember, he was saying there is also a spiritual substance. What exactly is the spiritual substance? The whole reality is spiritual substance? What's then material substance? No, both of them are reality, but they are different now. Material substance is where all the quality is attached. So there is something there which we perceive as a pen. But what about spiritual substance? It's our mind, right? It's each one of us. That's the spiritual substance. Something is sitting there doing the thinking. What is it? It surely doesn't seem to be material. So he was saying that is spiritual. However, he said, we actually know about as much about the spiritual substance as we do about material substance, which is what? Nothing. Nothing at all. We don't know anything about it. We know that it's there because we are here. So just like Descartes said, something's doing the thinking there. There must be something. But what it is, he said, that we do not know. Okay. So hopefully that's enough of a refresher, and we are prepared to talk about Berkeley today. Few words about who was George Berkeley. So like I said, he comes from Ireland. Most eminent Irish philosopher, born March 12, 1685. Again, next generation after Locke. Locke at that point was already a very old man. Berkeley was just born. Nonetheless, when Berkeley attended Trinity College in Dublin, he studied Locke. Locke was at that time already very widely studied in university. It's year 1700. Locke was about to die a few years later. Nonetheless, his essay was already published and studied by students. So he was familiar with Locke very well. He responds to Locke. He also was familiar with Descartes, another philosopher we talked about. Again, it was already part of the university curriculum. They knew about his work. So that kind of explains a lot of his ideas. He was reacting to essentially both of them, and as well as some other philosophers too. But these two are very important in order to understand Berkeley. Few other facts about him. In 1710, still fairly young man, now 25, he was ordained a priest in the Anglican Church. So he was an Anglican priest, not just a philosopher, but actually a priest. And then he is very closely connected to United States of America. Well, why? Well, for one thing, he traveled to America, and he was quite fascinated by it. He thought it's a new world, which actually is open to new spirit, new ideas, new everything. He was a huge advocate of establishing universities here and teaching, especially the indigenous people, giving them the wisdom, the science, and everything. He tried to obtain funding for that from the British government, and at first he was actually promised that he will get funding. However, he spent 3 years in America, and the funding did not come. He did donate a lot of books to what I believe now is New York University or Columbia. And actually, it's not a coincidence that University of California, Berkeley is named Berkeley. It is named Berkeley after George Berkeley. So quite a bit of presence here in the United States too. But like I said, after 3 years, he did come back to Britain, to Ireland actually. But Ireland at the time, remember, was part of British Kingdom. It actually obtained independence only in the 20th century. And at that period, it was just part of Britain. So he came back and became Bishop of Cloyne in 1734. Lived quite long by the standards life. January 14, 1753, he visited his son, who was a student at the University of Oxford, and died there. So now he is buried there in Oxford. in the chapel of Christ Church College. What were his ideas? Okay, let's take a look. The principal work for us here is written in 1710, a treatise concerning principles of human knowledge. It is, in a sense, like I said, a response to Locke. He does mention Locke by name a few times, and certainly more than a few times talks about his work. Now, one of the problems he had is with this whole skepticism and disbelief. Remember, he was a priest. That explains to you part of it. He thought that this entire scientific approach, especially Newtonian approach, was actually behind the entire disbelief, that behind people moving away from believing in God. Why? Well, we talked about it last time. Remember, it was explaining the world in this mechanistic way, and it seemed more and more like there's no room for God there whatsoever. At best, deists were saying God set up the world as some sort of clock mechanism, gave it a start, and then washed his hands. And God no longer interferes with anything because everything follows the laws of physics. So Berkeley had a problem with that. He had a problem with Newtonian physics in particular because he thought that it had a lot of assumptions which actually are not well justified. And he thought Locke's epistemology in particular was to blame. Epistemology, again, remember, is the theory of knowledge. The way Locke was saying we know things. Note that Berkeley had no problem with science. He actually thought science is necessary for us in order to learn how the world works. But he thought that Newtonian approach, this particular approach, and I remember one of the things about Newtonian approach which was very special is the idea of corpuscular matter, the atoms. Everything is made of these atoms, of tiny little chunks. The atomic approach. So everything is material, made of atoms, and we can study how things work if we think about it as being made of these tiny little bricks of reality. Okay, now what exactly was he saying? One of the first things he attacked in the introduction to his work were the abstract ideas. So once again, the abstract idea of a dog, let's say, is just, Locke was saying, we see all these dogs, and then we kind of form the idea of a dog, which is neither this dog, nor that dog, nor any dog in particular, but dog in general. Berkeley makes fun of that. He actually starts by saying, yeah, I dare you. Imagine a dog, which is neither big, nor small, nor furry, nor any particular color. Try that. Imagine that dog. If you can do it, you must be one amazing human being, because I can't. And I don't know who can. So he's saying every time we use a particular idea, we get fooled by the language. The language is what is fooling us. We talk about dog in general because it's a word and we can attach it to any particular item. But nonetheless, we never experience an abstract dog. All we experience is particular concrete dogs. Each one of them has a particular size, has a particular name, exists in a particular part of the universe. They are not abstract. So he's saying that's one of the problems we have. We form these abstract ideas and start thinking of them as some sort of reality. But they are not real. Every time we try to make them real, we are fooling ourselves. Many people would agree with that. Let's see where he's going. Now, here's the question to you guys. When you say apple, what exactly do you mean? Describe it. Fruit. What is fruit? Because if somebody never saw an apple and you tell him, oh, it's a fruit, will it help? He'd be like, what is fruit? Well, red, sweet, edible, that's good. Grows on trees, okay. So, all right. Now, note one interesting thing, that typically what you do here is you describe sensual memory of some sensual feed of senses, right? Now, how about matter? Do you ever experience matter? Yeah, that is his point. The senses, only the senses give you some particular feed about the world. Other than through the senses, you're not experiencing anything. So when people say, yeah, I experience matter, what they typically mean is when I bite into an apple, it is crunchy. Or when I try to squeeze it, my muscle doesn't go through the apple. It provides the resistance. But in both cases, what you actually are describing is your sensual feed. You have a sensual feed of crunchiness and that particular taste in your mouth, and you have another sensual feed through the muscles, through the nerves in your hand. Now, whether or not that is matter, note that we today can simulate that. You can actually simulate somebody's brain that they would have a feeling as if there is an apple. And in the matter of fact, hallucinations are like that too. And that's how exactly it works. Because it's a known fact too that, for example, if somebody had amputated leg or something, for a while they feel pain in that leg. And not just general pain, but in a particular spot they may have a pain in non-existing toe. Why? Well, because the nerves are still sending some sort of a signal. So essentially what it tells you is that you can perfectly well have a feeling of something being there when in fact it's not. Now, so this is exactly what he's saying. He's saying an apple to us really is a bundle of sensations. And note that this is like one of those slides which you do need to know for the exam. So if you describe an apple, that's what you would be saying. It's round, red, hard, crunchy, sweet. All of these are experiences. All of these are sensations. Now, your entire conception of an apple is the collection of ideas that are experienced and hence exist in your mind. So in this case, he agrees with Locke. He's saying, absolutely, all these ideas are in your mind. They're given to you by your senses. Period. So when Locke says that he doesn't know what substance is, Berkeley is saying, nobody knows what substance is. In fact, we don't know if there is a substance. We have no reason to believe in any substance. Because where do we get that idea? We make it up. It's an abstract idea. Just like an idea of an abstract dog. Where is that dog? There's Joey in front of me. Yesterday I saw Bubbly. But a dog, which is neither Joey, no Bubbly, no big, no small, no brown, no gray, doesn't exist. There's no such thing. So that's what he's saying. The idea of substance or matter is nowhere to be found. You can't find it. It doesn't exist. We have no reason to believe it exists. He's saying it's just common sense. Common sense tells us there is no matter. Why are we making it up? Why are we creating it out of thin air? Something we never experienced. Okay, so he calls his position immaterialism, which again is an important slide for you to note. So he's saying that if you strip away all these feelings, all these qualities of an apple which we just described, if you take away the shape, the color, the size, the taste, and the texture of an apple, what is left? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. There's no apple. So apple is nothing but the collection of all these feelings, all these qualities. There's nothing other than that. So he's saying there simply is no matter. And he calls himself an immaterialist. He's saying, I am an immaterialist for a very simple common sense reason. I just don't see how we can believe in matter which we never experience. We believe that there is redness, we believe that there is crunchiness, and so on, because we experience that. How do we believe in matter? We never experienced this one. Okay, so we, from now on, can call it idealism. Berkeley himself did not call himself an idealist, but this is where we can introduce this term. Idealism is the claim that only two kinds of things exist in reality: minds or spirits, and ideas they perceive. Note that it actually is different from solipsism, because solipsism claims that there is only your mind. Here, it's a plural. There are minds. So there's my mind, there's your mind, there's Peter's mind, and so on. And as we will soon find out, there's also a mind of God, the Spirit of God. But there's nothing other than that. There are these minds, and they have these ideas. This famous saying also is esse est praecipi. Esse est praecipi means to be is to be perceived. So he's saying the object exists because we perceive it. So our perception of an object, that is what we call existence. So when we say this pen is real, what does that mean? It means I can touch it, I can see it, I can write with it. All of these are my perceptions of that pen. Now, interestingly enough, he's saying, what happens if you leave the room and you no longer perceive the pen? He's saying the pen is no longer exists. And when you come back to the room, the pen will be there. So, how is it possible? Does the pen disappear? He's saying, no, it does not disappear. It's never there to begin with. It's just your perception of it which is there. And if you don't have a perception of it, there's no pen. Okay, so he is considering himself an empiricist, because again he bases all of this on our experience. He says, I'm just a little bit more precise than people like Locke. I am more common sense kind of guy. And my common sense tells me that we should not make up things which we do not know exist, in particular matter. He's saying Locke is as clear writer as I have met. He is a very smart guy, but he is completely mistaken about this simple thing. If we use his own advice to use our own judgment and see with our own eyes and not with somebody else's, this is the conclusion we should all actually reach. He's saying this is the common sense conclusions. So the problem with representative realism, which is Locke's position, is that we only know the ideas in our mind, which is true. But in the same time, we somehow believe that there is some separate reality out there which these ideas represent. Where do we get that part from? We don't touch this reality. We only have access to our own ideas, which is what Locke said. But if we will be consistent, we must say then that we really don't know if there's any other reality than our ideas. How can we make this leap and make up some sort of additional reality? Berkeley in particular claimed that the way Locke was talking about things, that is what leads to skepticism, to disbelief. Why? Well, remember, we did talk about like a representative realism. You are sitting in a room, somebody hands you pictures of the outside reality, representations. Now, naturally you may be skeptical. You may ask, what, this stuff really represent that reality out there? I don't know. When I see a pen, is this really the pen the way it is out there in real world, or is it some sort of distorted reality? I don't know. So he's saying that position, if you start making up this separate reality, leads to skepticism. How does Berkeley himself get out of it? Well, that's basically what we will talk about today. So he calls the Locke's position naive realism. Naive realism, according to Berkeley, is the belief that properties we observe objects to have are the properties they really do have in external world. So when I think that this pen really exists somewhere in the external world and is not just my perception of it, I'm being naive. I have no good reason to suppose that. There's really nothing which can prove that to me, because I never have access to this real pen in the real world. I only have access to my own sensual representation of it, which is an idea in my mind. So that's what he was saying. Now then he also attacks primary and secondary qualities rather well, and it's actually when we finally get rid of them, because ever since then philosophers stopped talking about primary and secondary qualities. Why? Well, he's saying that, remember why they were separating them. They were saying that certain qualities depend on the subjective perception, such as the taste, the color, and so on. They can be different from person to person, but certain qualities such as shape, figure, solidity, they don't depend on your subjective representation. And Berkeley is saying, really? Are you sure about that? How do you know? Do you somehow go outside your mind into the real world to figure out it really has all these qualities? What makes you believe there's any difference? If colors are dependent on a subject, how come the shape does not depend on a subject? Why do you think the shape of an object is really something which is there, but the color of it is not? It's entirely possible that both of them are not the way we see them, or both of them are exactly the same. So the argument itself, if you break it down, is kind of like this. So-called primary and secondary qualities cannot be separated in the mind. You can't even imagine a shape of a pen without its color. They always appear together. This is like a package kind of deal. Every time there's an apple, this apple will have a particular color. Imagine an apple which has no color whatsoever. It's not going to be an apple. I mean, I guess you can draw like an outline of an apple. But if you actually have an apple, if it is an actual apple, it will always have a color. So when you say one quality is mind dependent, you have to admit that the other one is mind dependent too. If you can have a red apple, but it really is green, then how do you know it really is round and not like triangular or something? Maybe that's just an illusion you have, just like with the color. So both of them, he's saying, are mind dependent. Then what's the difference between them? There's a fake difference. You simply cannot make this distinction. Now, in general, this whole representative theory of perception, the representative realism of Locke, of course, to Berkeley makes no sense whatsoever. This is what actually we already talked about. It's like somebody handing you pictures or copies of the outside world. Why would you believe this is actually what the world looks like? Somebody may be lying to you indeed. To saying all of this stuff we never have access to, we only have access to our ideas. Okay, we already covered that. Now, he himself is saying that gives us good grounds to believe that the only thing in existence, again, is our ideas and our minds. We have no good evidence for anything else. And people, he's saying, may then say, well, how does that gonna work? Wouldn't that mean that like things really will be different? And you say, no, it actually doesn't mean that at all. Saying by the principles premised, we are not derived of any one thing in nature. Whatever we see, feel, hear, or anywise conceive or understand remains as secure as ever and is as real as ever. Note that he's just changing a definition of the word real. The word real to him means that, for example, if you are going to walk into the room with the table, you will be able to have visual feed of a table, sensual feed of a table, and whatever other feed of a table your senses require. But what it will not mean is that there really is a table there. He's saying that the world most certainly exists. The table I write on, I say exists. That is, I see and feel it. And if I were out of my study, I should say it existed, meaning if I was in my study, I might perceive it. Or that some other spirit actually does perceive it. So if your friend is in that room and using that table, he perceives it. Now, there's an interesting thought experiment he's saying. To prove his point, he's saying, try to imagine a table, let's say in a classroom, not another classroom in this case because we are not in a classroom, right? But try to imagine a table in a classroom right now, not as being perceived, not perceived by anybody. Can you do it? Well, there's a little bit of a catch about that because many people would say, yes, we can. It's like, imagine a tree on Mars or something. Now, the catch there is this. When you imagine it, you actually have an idea of it, so you are the one perceiving it. And if nobody perceives it, if you don't have that idea, then it doesn't exist. Well, you imagining it, yes, by itself, is already kind of perception, right? So let's say you are imagining a tree. Somebody can say, hey, it's easy. I can imagine a tree right now, thousands of miles away, and it's not being perceived. So then the question is, well, can you draw it? How does it look like? And somebody can say, yeah, sure, it's like this. And it's like, well, look, but you already have a particular perspective on it, right? Because if you looked at it from top, then it would probably look like this. So note that you actually not just imagining it, you actually have a rather clear idea of what it looks like. So you are perceiving it then, in your mind. And if there's no mind whatsoever to perceive it, then it really doesn't exist. That's basically his point. So now we're getting to a more interesting point he's making. So where do all these ideas then come from? Because note that one of the criticism is, so what, we are just imagining the whole world? But if we do, how come I cannot imagine $1 million on my table right now? I would like to. Yet somehow it doesn't work, right? So what's the catch? He's saying, so where do these ideas can come from? Can they cause each other? And he's saying, no, the ideas themselves are passive. One idea cannot cause another idea. Can material substance, matter, give us these ideas? The way, Locke was thinking. He's saying, but we already refuted the idea that that material substance even exists. We don't have any proof of that, and in fact, it's seems unnecessary. So what could be causing our ideas? What do you guys think? There's a rather simple and ingenious answer he gives to that. No, but note again, we have to reject our minds. If your mind gives you the ideas, then your mind must be able to create the world the way you want it. Then you can have $1 million on the table right now. Why not? Your mind will create this idea. But you can't, can you? I wish I could. God! Exactly. God! The world indeed comes from God. God is a spirit, just like we are, and he gives us the ideas of the world. That is his answer. So, incorporeal, active substance or spirit which we all call God. That is where it comes from. Okay, we already did that. So this is the idea. He's saying that actually makes perfect sense. He's saying the way people typically think about it, note that the way most people thought about it for generations was this. God created an apple, created the world, right? And then we perceive this apple. This is the idea of an apple. He's saying, why God would bother with that? Doesn't it seem unnecessary? He's all powerful. Why can't he just feed this right into our brain? Why does he have to do this unnecessary work of creating some stupid unnecessary world just so that we could perceive it, if he can do it directly? Doesn't it make sense? What do you think? Yes, it definitely seems like a logical answer. He's saying, makes perfect sense. Because it's kind of completely unnecessary work for God to create the whole world and then, in addition to that, create a human being so that human being would be perceiving this world, and that's like what is going on. God can do it directly into your head. And note that we already mentioned that when we talked about Descartes. Descartes thought that the God is guarantor of the fact that world really exists, because he thought otherwise God will be deceiving us. But here there's no deception, because the only deception would be if there was a separate real world somewhere out there and God was telling us that some other world is the real world. But here, that's the only world. God never told us there's actual apple. When did God ever tell you this? He gives you an idea of an apple, and it is as real as the real apple. It's as real as it can be. Of course it's real. That's the reality. Okay, so he's saying science, laws of nature are not affected by this stuff at all, because all the laws are just tell you that all these ideas are very, very well connected by God. God makes sure that every time you stick a needle in your arm, you feel pain. The idea of a needle and the idea of a pain are connected. God made sure that all these laws of gravity and so on working perfectly well for you, because all these ideas indeed make up this perfectly reliable reality. So there's not any one phenomenon explained on that supposition that matter exists, which may not as well be explained without it. You really don't need matter to believe in science, to believe that when you stick a pin in your hand it will be painful. The laws of nature definitely work reliably. We can expect them to work, but we have to keep in mind that there's no causes and effects. What we call a cause, he's saying, is a sign. It's a sign which signifies to us that a particular thing is coming up. So, for example, if a needle has been pointing at your arm and about to penetrate your skin, that is a very clear sign that you will feel pain. So it is a reliable succession of ideas. And you can be damn sure that every time you see a needle about to stick into your hand, you will feel pain. And equally with gravity. Every time I will drop this, let go of this pen, it will fall down. Because this is how this succession of ideas set up by God. Now, interestingly enough, many of the things he was saying are very modern. They are actually hell a lot ahead of his time. Many people who disagree with him about some parts of his philosophy, modern philosophers, actually agree with him overall. Agree with him about certain aspects of it. One good example is, of course, challenging Newton. Because as we already mentioned, and if you take physics as you will learn, Newtonian physics has been actually rejected, and the most current theory is by who? not by Newton, but by, do you guys know? Which physics replaced Newtonian physics? So Newtonian physics, again, remember, absolute space, absolute time. So the space to Newton is like this gigantic container, like, right? The reality is like this big chunk of empty space. And the time is absolute in the sense that it very monotonously moving in one direction, a year after year after year after year. That's how Newton thought about it, and it worked for a long time. But today, in physics, we actually are saying that's not how it works. Exactly. Einstein's theory of general relativity and then special relativity. This is exactly what is currently prevailing, and it is more or less how Berkeley amazingly thought about it. Space and time are not absolute. They are relative. And by the way, just a little explanation about how did Einstein himself came to that, even though I'm not a physicist, but I know a little bit about that. So here's the idea. He was saying, again, think about this mental experiment. Let's say you have a person standing on the ground with the flashlight, pointing the flashlight in a particular direction. Now we know the speed of light. If I'm not mistaken, it's 300,000 kilometers per second, something like that. Don't quote me on that, but the speed of light is maximum speed you can possibly have. So let's say it is 300,000 kilometers per second. So you cannot have a faster speed. Great. Now he's saying, suppose next to this person a train is running. And on that train, which moves with a speed of 100 kilometers per hour, there is another person who is also pointing a flashlight in the same direction. Now here's the problem. Shouldn't it be 100 kilometers per hour faster than the first one? And Einstein's answer is no, it cannot be, because 300,000 kilometers per second, the speed of light, is the fastest you can go in this world. You cannot go any faster. So what's the problem then? The problem is it's relative to the perceiver. It's not absolute. The speed and the time can move differently for different perceivers. So that's basically the idea of general relativity in a nutshell. Space and time, in other words, are not completely real. They are relative. So that actually kind of confirms what Berkeley was saying. There's a number of other things there. Concerning motion, Berkeley was saying, it does not appear to me that there can be any motion other than relative. So that to conceive motion, there must be at least conceived two bodies whereof the distance of position in regard to each is varied. Absolutely true. And note that also, if you are into this space travel and other stuff, you probably know that's why we are saying that if somebody flies into outer space with a very high speed, not even necessarily speed of light, but very fast for many years and then comes back, because time for that person slows down, he will come back, his children will be older than that person is. Why? Because the speed will matter. The time will move differently for the person who is moving with a high speed. So that actually is a fact. That is the Einsteinian physics. So motion is relative, time is relative. There's a whole bunch of other stuff here. So relativity of simultaneity. This is from Einstein's physics. Two events simultaneous for one observer may not be simultaneous for another observer if the observer is in motion. So for you, two things happen simultaneously. If somebody moves really quickly on some sort of a spacecraft, for him, they are not. time dilation, moving clocks measured to tick more slowly than an observer's stationary clock. This is an experiment scientists actually confirmed. If you have clocks on a very fast moving vehicle or whatever, it actually slows down. That is a fact. They measured it. This is not just an idea. This is confirmed by science. Length contraction. Objects are measured to be shortened in the direction that they are moving. So if you have a moving object, it actually shrinks. Amazingly. But it is a fact. So all this stuff, and including the famous mass-energy equivalence, which is that energy is mass per second square. Energy and mass are equivalent. What it means is you can convert mass to energy and energy back to mass. So matter can turn into pure energy, into nothing. So all these things have been confirmed in the 20th century, but Berkeley amazingly kind of predicted them back in his day. That part of his philosophy amazingly is way ahead of his time. So few questions we can now ask here. So one question many philosophers then were saying is, okay, but doesn't it mean we have the idea of God? How can we have the idea of God? Note that that idea has to come from somewhere. So that actually is somewhat problematic with his philosophy, because we also never experienced God, right? So for all he's saying, we should not say there is God, because since we never experienced God, we do not have any right to claim God exists, just like we do not have any right to claim that matter exists. So what's his answer? He's saying, well, since therefore we have no idea of the mind of God, how can we conceive it possible that things should exist in his mind? If you can't conceive the mind of God without having an idea of it, why may I not be allowed to conceive the existence of matter, notwithstanding having an idea of it? Well, he's saying we do not have the idea of God, but we have notions. We have a notion of God. Because I'm directly aware of my own mental operations, I have a notion of myself, right? It's not an idea of myself. I don't really have some sort of physical experience of myself, but I have a notion that there's something there. So similarly, he's saying I can have a notion of God because it just kind of makes sense to have God behind all these experiences. So he's saying it's not really an idea, it is a notion. That's what it is. Notion of this type of a perfect mind, which is necessary in order for all these ideas to be consistent, for the world to be following particular rules, rather than, completely random. Now, there's another bit of interesting, not so much even a criticism as evaluation of his philosophy, which came up again after already during his life and later. So it goes like this. So basically we have three options then. One option, which he obviously rejects, is again solipsism. And solipsism is the claim that there is no reality outside my own mind and its content. Now that he obviously rejects, he says, no. There are other minds, they are in existence, and there is God, who is also in existence. Okay, now the second possibility here would be that my ideas being representations of God's ideas, right? Because the question here is, if God gives us these ideas, do they actually represent the way God understands the world or not? Do they match? So when I have an idea of a pen, does God have an idea of a pen? Right? So that is the question. Now, note that if it doesn't, if the way we see the world is not the way God sees the world, then that would, of course, be a problem, and then we have God who is a liar. He's lying to us. The pen really doesn't look like that, but he tells us it does. So in that case, we actually do have a problem. Now, note that there is one more possibility. What is it? What do you think? Do you see what other possibility there is? Are you kind of following what I'm talking about? So the world is given to us by God as an idea. But the question is, does this idea match the way God himself perceives the world? And if it doesn't, then he's a liar. He's lying to us. But if it does, that's the other possibility. Then what does that mean? Well, it basically means that our mind is the mind of God. Because the only way we can perceive everything the way God perceives it is if we are part of God. That's actually what is known as Pantheism. Pantheism is this idea that God is everything. God is our mind. We are God. So that essentially is the only other option. Again, Berkeley would not accept that because remember, he is a Anglican priest. So naturally, for him to say pantheism is the way reality works is unacceptable because the church does not allow pantheism. Nonetheless, he doesn't seem to have any other choice. Either God is a liar or we are part of God. Because if we perceive the world in the same way as God does, then we must be part of God. Now that actually is how Schopenhauer will be describing it. I don't think we actually have time to talk about Schopenhauer. Maybe I should make a lecture on Schopenhauer, because he is very, very interesting. It's already 19th century German philosophy. Lots of people love Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer kind of picked up some of the ideas from Kant, first of all, who we will talk about next week, and Berkeley. And he actually thinks that this is more or less how it is. These pantheist ideas, they will become very prominent in German idealism, in particular in Germany, 19th century Germany. The idea that we are all God. The whole reality is God. There's no separate God somewhere out there. We are part of God. So God kind of is all of us. It's just that because there's so many of us, that's why none of us in particular can create reality the way I said. We can't have $1 million on a table, because in order for me to have $1 million on the table, not only my mind has to imagine that, but every other mind there is. Your mind, my wife's mind, and so on. So if everybody perceives that I have $1 million on the table, then it really is there. But if not, then it's not. So then that kind of leads you towards the idea that there's no separate God, but the God is all the human minds together. But that already is a couple of 100 years later. That is, like I said, German idealism. We will get there a little bit later. So anyway, that is philosophy of Berkeley, more or less in a nutshell. And I thought that it deserves kind of a special lecture because it is a lot more interesting than the book allows for it, like 1 page or something. And it is important too to understand Kant, because both Hume, who we'll talk about on Monday, and Kant have reacted to Berkeley. Berkeley definitely made a huge impact with his ideas. Even though most people did not necessarily accept it, especially at the time, people did kind of realize that he's onto something here. The way he was describing reality was thought-provoking. And a lot of people said, we did not think about it this way. But if you start thinking about it this way, he's onto something here. Because indeed, representative realism of Locke does seem to be problematic. We cannot just say that there is reality out there if we are locked into our mind and have no access to this reality. There gotta be some sort of a way for us to have access to this reality outside of us. Otherwise, how do we know the world even exists? And that's what Berkeley says. Then we must be skeptics. Then we must say, I have no idea if the world is even there. So the skepticism part, that will be Hume, and that's why the whole chapter is called The Skeptic. And then after Hume we'll have Kant, who actually kind of tried to synthesize the whole thing and give it a very interesting and very influential explanation. Definitely not something that anybody before him came up with. Okay, so I guess we can wrap it up. Chapter 11 reading, that's next week's reading on Kant, I believe. If you still have to do it, we'll talk about Kant on Wednesday. On Monday we'll talk about Hume, chapter 10. That's like second half of the chapter 10. The homework is actually on Locke, Berkeley, and Hume together, because they all in chapter 10. We still didn't talk about Hume, but I don't think it'll be a big problem. If you read the chapter, that's more than enough to be able to do the homework. Homework again is due Sunday, 21st, as usual, 11:59 p.m. We'll talk about Hume on Monday, and then we'll talk about Kant on Wednesday. And remember, after that, the first day of school after the spring break, which is 5th of April, we will have our second midterm exam, which will be on all this material, starting from where did we start with Aquinas and ending with Kant. Okay, any questions? Okay, well, if you guys don't have any questions, I guess we can wrap up a few minutes earlier, or if you do, that